I never thought I'd be the kind of person who remembers every single detail of a random Tuesday in July. But here we are, 3 years later, and I can still tell you exactly what the air smelled like that night. Pine needles and campfire smoke and something else. Something I couldn't name then, but recognize now as the scent of everything about to change. My name is Logan, and I was 22 that summer, working as a counselor at a wilderness camp in the mountains of Colorado. It was one of those jobs you take when you're fresh out of college and have no idea what you're doing with your life. The pay was terrible, the hours were long, and I'd never been happier. Something about being away from everything, surrounded by trees and stars and kids who thought catching a fish was the most exciting thing in the world. It made sense in a way the rest of my life didn't. The counselors stayed in this old lodge at the edge of camp, a sprawling wooden building with creaky floors and bunk beds that had probably been there since the 1970s. Most of us had claimed our spots the first week, spreading out to give everyone space. There were maybe 15 of us total, and the lodge could easily sleep 30, so privacy wasn't an issue. I'd taken a bottom bunk near the window because I liked being able to see outside when I couldn't sleep, which was often. That's where I was when Miles walked in. I'd seen him around camp, of course. He'd arrived 2 weeks into the summer session, hired last minute when one of the other counselors had to leave for a family emergency. He was tall, maybe 6'1" or 6'2", with dark hair that was always falling into his eyes, and this way of moving that seemed almost careful, like he was constantly aware of the space he took up. We'd exchanged maybe 10 words total, just the usual, "Hey, how's it going" stuff you say to co-workers you don't really know yet. It was late, past midnight, and I was reading by flashlight because the overhead lights were on a timer, and I didn't want to wake anyone. I heard footsteps on the stairs and looked up to see Miles standing in the doorway with his sleeping bag under one arm and a backpack slung over his shoulder. He was wearing grey sweatpants and an old college t-shirt, and his hair was damp like he'd just showered. He stood there for a second, just looking around the room, and I went back to my book, assuming he was grabbing something he'd forgotten. But then I heard his footsteps getting closer, and when I looked up again, he was standing right next to my bunk. "Hey," he said, his voice quiet in the darkness. "Sorry to bother you. I know this is weird, but would you mind if I took the bunk above yours?" I blinked at him, confused. The bunk above me had been empty all summer, so had the one next to mine. Actually, there were at least 6 empty bunks within 10 feet of where we were standing, all of them closer to the door and the bathroom. Sure," I said, because what else do you say? "But there are empty ones over there too if you want more space." "I know," Miles said, and he shifted his weight from one foot to the other in this way that made him seem suddenly younger, almost nervous. I sleep better when I'm near other people. I know that probably sounds strange. It did sound strange, but there was something about the way he said it, this quiet honesty that made it impossible to question. "No problem," I said, and I meant it. "Make yourself at home." I watched as he climbed up to the top bunk, the whole frame shaking slightly as he settled in. I heard the rustle of his sleeping bag, the soft thud of his backpack hitting the floor, and then silence. I tried to go back to my book, but I couldn't focus. I kept thinking about what he'd said, about sleeping better near other people, and wondering what that meant. Was it an anxiety thing? Had something happened to him? Or was it just one of those quirks that everyone has? The kind of thing you don't think twice about until someone points it out. "Thanks, Logan." His voice came from above me, soft in the darkness. "No worries," I said, and I clicked off my flashlight. I lay there in the dark, listening to the sound of his breathing slowly evening out as he fell asleep. It should have been weird, having someone I barely knew sleeping 3 feet above my head, but it wasn't. If anything, It was comforting. I fell asleep faster that night than I had in weeks. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight streaming through the window and the smell of coffee drifting up from the kitchen downstairs. Miles was already gone, his bunk made with military precision, his backpack nowhere to be seen. I might have thought I'd dreamed the whole thing if not for the faint impression his sleeping bag had left on the mattress above me. I saw him later that morning during the staff meeting, sitting in the back row with a notebook open on his lap, actually taking notes while the camp director droned on about schedule changes and safety protocols. Most of us were half asleep, nursing our coffee and trying not to doze off, but Miles looked alert, engaged, like he actually cared about the difference between the old emergency evacuation route and the new one. After the meeting, I found myself walking next to him on the path back to the main camp area. "So," I said, because the silence felt awkward, and I've never been good with awkward. "How are you settling in?" He glanced at me, and I noticed for the first time that his eyes were this really striking shade of grey-green, like the ocean before a storm. "Good," he said. "Everyone's been really welcoming. Thanks again for last night." I know it was a weird request. "Honestly, don't worry about it," I said. "I get it. I mean, I don't totally get it, but I get that everyone has their things, you know." He smiled at that, just a small quirk of his lips, but it changed his whole face, made him look less guarded, more open. "Yeah," he said. "Everyone has their things." We walked in comfortable silence for a moment, and then he asked, "What are your things?" I laughed, surprised by the question. "My things? Man, where do I start? I'm a chronic overthinker. I make lists for everything, even things that don't need lists. I can't sleep without a fan running, even in winter. I've watched the entire series of The Office probably 15 times. I'm secretly terrified of birds." "Birds?" He raised an eyebrow. "Dude, they're dinosaurs. They have those little claws and those beady eyes, and they can just swoop down out of nowhere. It's unsettling." He laughed then, a real laugh, and something in my chest did this weird little flip. "That's fair," he said. "I never thought about it that way, but you're right. Birds are basically tiny velociraptors." "Exactly," I said, probably too enthusiastically, but he was still smiling, so I didn't care. That's how it started, I think, not with anything dramatic or obvious, but with a conversation about birds and sleeping habits and the mundane details that make up a life. Over the next few weeks, it became routine. Miles would come back to the lodge late. After finishing up whatever project he was working on, he was always staying late to help with something, and he'd climb into the bunk above mine. Sometimes we'd talk for a while in the darkness, our voices low so we wouldn't wake the others. Sometimes we'd just say, "Good night," and drift off to sleep. I learned things about him in those conversations. That he'd grown up in Seattle. That he was the youngest of 4 kids. That he'd studied environmental science in college and was trying to figure out if he wanted to go to grad school or find a job in conservation. That he played guitar but hadn't brought his with him to camp because he didn't think he'd have time. That his favorite food was his mom's homemade dumplings, and he'd been craving them for weeks. I told him things too. About growing up in a small town in Ohio where everyone knew everyone and nothing ever changed. About my parents' divorce when I was 16 and how I'd spent that whole year feeling like I was walking on eggshells. About my best friend from college who'd moved to Japan to teach English and how I missed him every day. About how I'd applied to camp on a whim, just needing to get away from everything familiar, and how it had turned out to be exactly what I needed. It was easy talking to Miles. Easier than it had been with anyone in a long time. He listened in this way that made you feel like what you were saying actually mattered, like he was filing away every detail to remember later. And he never judged. Never made me feel stupid for the things I worried about or the things I wanted. But it wasn't just the talking. It was the other stuff too. The way he'd save me a seat at dinner without making a big deal about it. The way he'd remember that I hated raisins and would trade me his cookie if the kitchen made oatmeal raisin instead of chocolate chip. The way he'd catch my eye across the campfire during evening programs and smile. Just this little private smile that felt like it was meant only for me. I started noticing things I probably shouldn't have been noticing. The way his t-shirts fit across his shoulders. The way his hands moved when he was explaining something he was passionate about. The way he'd push his hair back from his forehead when he was concentrating. The sound of his laugh, which was deeper than his speaking voice, and always seemed to catch me off guard. I told myself it didn't mean anything. We were friends. Good friends. That's all it was. But then came the night of the thunderstorm. It rolled in around 10 p.m., one of those massive summer storms that turns the sky green and makes the air feel electric. The kids were all safely in their cabins with their counselors, and those of us who were off duty had gathered in the lodge common room to wait it out. Someone had made popcorn, and we were playing cards and telling stories and pretending we weren't all a little nervous about the lightning that kept illuminating the windows in sharp white flashes. Miles was sitting across from me, dealing out cards for another round of poker, when the power went out. The whole lodge went dark except for the occasional flash of lightning, and someone screamed. And then everyone was laughing nervously and fumbling for their phones to use as flashlights. "I'll go check the breaker," one of the other counselors said, and a couple people went with him, leaving the rest of us sitting in the dark. I felt someone slide onto the couch next to me, close enough that our shoulders were touching. I knew it was Miles before he even spoke. I'd gotten so used to his presence over the past few weeks that I could recognize him by proximity alone, by the way the air felt different when he was near. "You okay?" he asked quietly, his voice almost lost under the sound of rain hammering against the roof. "Yeah," I said. "You?" "I'm good." But his shoulder was pressed against mine, solid and warm, and I could feel the tension in him. "You don't like storms?" I asked. "Not my favorite," he admitted. "When I was a kid, lightning struck a tree in our backyard during a storm. It split the whole thing in half, just this massive crack and then fire. I was looking out the window when it happened. I know statistically it's incredibly rare, but I've been weird about storms ever since." Without thinking, I reached over and found his hand in the darkness. His fingers were cold, and I wrapped mine around them, giving a gentle squeeze. "It's okay," I said. "We're safe here." He squeezed back, and neither of us let go. We sat like that for a while, hands clasped in the darkness, listening to the storm rage outside. I was hyper-aware of every point of contact between us. His shoulder against mine, his knee pressing against my leg, his fingers interlaced with my own. My heart was pounding so hard I was sure he could hear it. When the lights finally came back on, we both blinked against the sudden brightness. But we still didn't let go. Not right away. We sat there for another few seconds, and then Miles slowly pulled his hand back, and I felt the loss of contact like a physical thing. "Thanks," he said, not quite meeting my eyes. "Any time," I said. And I meant it. That night, lying in my bunk with Miles sleeping above me, I couldn't stop thinking about his hand in mine, about how right it had felt, how natural, about how much I wanted to reach up and touch him again, just to make sure he was real, to convince myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing. That's when I knew. That's when I couldn't pretend anymore. I was falling for him. Maybe had already fallen. The realization should have scared me. I'd never really thought about guys that way before. I mean, I'd had girlfriends in high school and college, relationships that had felt nice enough, but never quite right, never quite clicked in the way everyone said they should. I'd always assumed I just hadn't met the right person yet. But lying there in the darkness, listening to Miles breathe, I understood. It wasn't that I hadn't met the right person. It was that I'd been looking in the wrong places. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept replaying every interaction we'd had, seeing them all in a new light. The way he'd chosen the bunk above mine when there were plenty of others available. The way he always seemed to know where I was, like he had some kind of internal Logan radar. The way he looked at me sometimes, when he thought I wasn't paying attention. With this expression I couldn't quite read, but that made my stomach do backflips. Did he feel it too? Or was I reading into things that weren't there? Seeing what I wanted to see? The next few days were torture. I became painfully self-conscious around him, second-guessing everything I said and did. I caught myself staring at him more than once, and had to force myself to look away. I volunteered for extra shifts, just to have an excuse to be near him, which was pathetic, but I couldn't seem to help myself. If Miles noticed anything different, he didn't say. He was the same as always, warm and easy and completely unaware that he was slowly driving me insane. Then came the overnight camping trip. Once a month, the counselors took turns leading a small group of older kids on an overnight backpacking trip into the wilderness. It was one of the most popular programs at camp, and kids had to sign up weeks in advance to get a spot. Miles and I had been assigned to lead the next trip together, along with one other counselor, a girl named Sarah, who I'd known since the first week of camp. We set out early on a Wednesday morning, 8 kids and 3 counselors, loaded down with tents and sleeping bags, and enough food for 2 days. The hike was beautiful, following a trail that wound through dense forest and eventually opened up onto a meadow with a view of the mountains that made you understand why people write poetry about nature. We set up camp in the meadow, the kids working together to pitch tents while Miles got the fire started and I organized the food supplies. It was good, being out there with nothing but trees and sky and the sound of kids laughing. It felt like the rest of the world didn't exist, like we were all suspended in this perfect moment. That night, after the kids were settled in their tents and Sarah had gone to bed, Miles and I sat by the dying fire, not quite ready to call it a night. The stars were incredible, more than I'd ever seen, spread across the sky like someone had spilled a jar of diamonds. I could stay out here forever, Miles said, his voice quiet in the darkness. Just forget about everything else and live in the woods. That's very into the wild of you, I said, though maybe with less of the dying alone in an abandoned bus part. He laughed. Fair point. Okay, not forever, but for a while. There's something about being out here that makes everything else seem less complicated, you know. Yeah, I said. I know exactly what you mean. We sat in silence for a moment, and then Miles said, Can I ask you something? My heart started racing. Sure. Have you ever felt like you were waiting for something to happen, but you didn't know what it was? Like there's this thing just out of reach, and you can almost see it, but not quite. I looked at him. His face was lit by the glow of the embers, all shadows and angles, and he was staring into the fire, like the answers to all his questions might be hidden in the flames. Yeah, I said carefully. I felt like that. What did you do about it? I took a breath. This was it. I could play it safe, give some vague non-answer, and keep everything the way it was. Or I could be brave. I could be honest. I'm still figuring that out, I said. But I think maybe the thing I've been waiting for has been here all along. I just didn't recognize it at first. Miles turned to look at me then. Really look at me. And the expression on his face made my breath catch. Logan, he said. And my name had never sounded like that before. Soft and careful and full of something I was afraid to name. I need to tell you something, I said, before I could lose my nerve. And it might be weird, and it might mess everything up, but I can't keep pretending I don't feel it. Miles, I think I'm falling for you. Actually, I don't think. I know. I'm falling for you, and it scares the hell out of me, but it's true. For a moment, he just stared at me, and I was sure I'd made a terrible mistake. But then he smiled. This slow, wonderful smile that started in his eyes and spread across his whole face. Logan, he said again, why do you think I asked to share your bunk that first night? My brain stuttered to a stop. What? There were empty bunks everywhere. I could have taken any of them. But I saw you sitting there, reading by flashlight. And I thought you were the most interesting person I'd seen in years. And I wanted to be near you. I've wanted to be near you every single day since. You wait. You've felt this way since the beginning. Pretty much since the moment I walked into that lodge and saw you. I'm not usually that impulsive. But something about you made me brave. He reached over and took my hand, the same way I'd taken his during the storm. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. I've been going crazy, trying to figure out if you might feel the same way. I laughed, a little breathless. I've been going crazy too. I thought I was reading into things. You weren't, he said. You're not. Logan, I'm falling for you too. Have been for weeks. I don't know which of us moved first, but suddenly the space between us was gone and his hand was on my face, and mine was tangled in his hair, and we were kissing, soft and tentative and perfect. He tasted like campfire smoke and chocolate from the s'mores we'd made earlier, and when he pulled back just far enough to look at me, his eyes were bright with something that looked a lot like happiness. Is this okay? He asked. This is more than okay, I said and kissed him again. We stayed up for hours after that, talking and kissing and making plans. Plans for what we'd do when camp ended, how we'd make this work, where we'd go. He told me he'd been planning to move to Denver in the fall, and I told him I'd been thinking about Denver too, that I had a friend there who'd been trying to convince me to move for months. We laughed at the coincidence, at how we'd both been circling around the same future without knowing it. When we finally went to bed, we zipped our sleeping bags together and lay there looking up at the stars through the mesh roof of the tent. Miles's arm was around me, my head on his chest, and I could hear his heartbeat, steady and strong. I'm really glad you asked to share my bunk, I said. I'm really glad you said yes, he replied. That was 3 years ago. We're still in Denver, sharing an apartment that's way too small and costs way too much. But it's ours. Miles is in grad school now, studying conservation biology, and I'm working for a non-profit that runs outdoor education programs for kids. We go camping whenever we can, and sometimes we lie in our tent and talk about that first overnight trip, about how we almost didn't say anything, about how different everything could have been. But we did say something. We were brave. And that made all the difference. I still think about that night sometimes, when Miles walked into the lodge with his sleeping bag and asked to share my bunk. How easy it would have been to say no, to suggest he take one of the empty bunks across the room. How I might never have known what I was missing. But I said yes. And he climbed into the bunk above mine. And slowly, night by night, conversation by conversation, we fell in love. These days we have an actual bed instead of bunk beds, though Miles still jokes about getting some just for nostalgia's sake. But the important part hasn't changed. Every night I fall asleep listening to him breathe. And every morning I wake up grateful that he was brave enough to ask. And I was brave enough to let him in. Love isn't always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's quiet. Sometimes it's someone asking to share your bunk when there are empty ones across the room. Sometimes it's recognizing that the thing you've been waiting for has been right there all along. You just have to be brave enough to see it.